The frost came early to Dunmore Creek that October, and Isobel Vane arrived with it. She stepped off the supply wagon with a carpet bag in one hand and a letter she'd read so many times the fold lines had worn through, watching the man who was supposed to be her future walk toward her, across frozen mud without smiling. He didn't extend his hand either, just stopped a few feet away and looked at her the way a person looks at weather they weren't expecting. Calloway Reid, she thought. That was the name signed at the bottom of the letter. Practical arrangement. 2 children. Ranch work is hard. Come if you're willing. She'd come because willing was the only thing she had left. Miss Vane. His voice was low, unhurried. He had the look of a man who'd spent years outside, weathered through, lean in the jaw, dark circles under eyes that were doing the same assessing she was trying not to do. Mr. Reid. He looked at her bag. That all you brought? Yes. He turned and walked toward the wagon he'd arrived in without another word. Isobel picked up her bag and followed, which she supposed was how it was going to be. The Reid property sat 4 miles outside Dunmore Creek, down a rutted track that the wagon complained about the whole way. The land opened as they rode, flat pastured fields fading into scrub timber, a gray sky pressing down on all of it, a farmhouse with a porch that leaned slightly eastward, a barn that didn't, 2 small faces appearing in the window as they pulled up, then disappearing. Rosie is 7, Reid said, the first words he'd spoken since town. Callum is 5. They know you're coming. He said it like a warning. The children met them at the door. The girl had her father's serious eyes and her mother's coloring, whoever her mother had been. She looked at Isobel with the careful blankness of a child who has learned not to hope for things. The boy stood slightly behind his sister, one hand gripping her sleeve. This is Miss Vane, Reid said. Isobel said, you can call me Isobel. Rosie said nothing. Callum said, Papa, she has red boots. I noticed they were the only good boots Isobel owned, and she'd worn them specifically to feel like herself on a day that otherwise felt like being handed over to strangers, which it was. Inside, the house was clean in the way things are clean when someone has made an effort they don't normally make. A fresh cloth on the table. Curtains recently straightened. A smell of something baked sitting under the general smell of wood smoke and livestock and a life that didn't have enough hours in it. Reid showed her the room she'd sleep in, narrow, with a window that faced the barn, a bed with a quilt that had seen better years but was clearly freshly washed. Meals at 6 and noon and 6, he said. Children get up at 5:30 on school days. Wednesdays and Saturdays they help with chores before I take them into town. He listed her duties the way he'd listed the children's names. Not unkindly, just efficiently, like a man who had learned to manage without waste. And the wage, Isobel said, he told her. It was fair. Not generous, but fair. And fair was more than she'd had in Winnipeg after her aunt died, and the shop closed, and the landlord explained with great patience that sentimental attachment to a lease was not in fact the same as money. She'd answered Reid's advertisement, because it was the only one that didn't ask for a photograph first. The first week was the hardest in the way all first weeks are hard. Learning where everything lived, learning the children's silences as well as their words. Learning that Reid left before dawn, and came in after dark and ate whatever she put in front of him without comment or complaint. She couldn't tell if that was approval or indifference, and decided to treat it as approval until proven otherwise. Rosie warmed up Thursday, which Isobel hadn't expected. She'd assumed it would take months. She'd braced herself for months. But the girl appeared at her elbow on Thursday afternoon, while Isobel was mending a tear in Callum's coat, and said, Mama used to do that differently. How did she do it? Rosie showed her with one small finger, tracing a different stitch pattern. Isobel looked at it, then said, That's better, actually. Will you show me? Something shifted in Rosie's face. Not a smile, not yet, but something looser than the careful blankness. Okay, she said, and sat down. Callum took longer. He watched Isobel from corners and doorways for 2 weeks before he allowed himself to be read to, and another week before he'd sit beside her rather than across the room. She didn't push. Some things couldn't be pushed. Read she couldn't read at all. He was not cold exactly. He answered when she spoke to him, helped carry in the water barrel without being asked, said thank you for meals with what seemed like genuine feeling. But there was a wall around him so practiced it had become invisible to him. He didn't notice it, he'd just been living inside it so long it felt like his skin. She'd learned from his daughter that the wife's name had been Margaret, that she'd died 3 winters ago of a fever that started as a cough. That before she died, she'd made Reid promise to find some to help with the children, which he'd apparently taken 2 years to do anything about, and even then had been talked into the advertisement by his neighbor, a woman named Dorothy Hatch, who appeared every Sunday like a force of weather. Did you know Mr. Reid was looking for help? Isobel asked Dorothy one Sunday in November, when Dorothy had stayed for coffee and Reid was outside with the children. I told him he was going to break those kids raising them alone, Dorothy said with the frankness of a woman who'd earned the right to say what she thought. Man works himself to nothing and loves those two children completely and has no idea how to show it because nobody showed him. Margaret understood that about him. She translated. Dorothy looked at Isobel over her cup. You've got patient eyes. That'll matter. I'm just the housekeeper. Dorothy's expression said she had opinions about that, but was choosing for now to keep them. The snow came in November for real, covering the fields, silencing everything. Isobel had grown up in Manitoba. She knew winters. But Dunmore Creek cold had a particular character. It came under doors. It lived in the walls. It made the dark, arrive at 4 in the afternoon, and refused to leave until 7:30 the next morning. She read to the children by lamplight after supper. Callum fell asleep one night with his head against her arm, and she sat very still for a long time so as not to wake him. Listening to the wind outside, and the occasional creak of Reid's chair in the other room, where he was going over account books, he'd started leaving open on the table, no longer putting them away when she came in the room. It was a small thing. She noticed it. December brought the trouble. A man arrived on a gray Wednesday morning, while Reid was out checking fence line. Isobel opened the door to find a man in a town coat standing on the porch with an expression that had learned to look pleasant while being neither. Mrs. Reid, he said, Miss Vane. Can I help you? His name was Aldous Croft. She read it off the card he produced, thick cream paper with an address in Lethbridge. And he was, he said, acting on behalf of the Meridian Land Trust regarding outstanding obligations connected to the Reid property. Mr. Reid isn't here, Isobel said. Yes, I know, Croft said. I'll wait. He came inside without being invited, sat at the kitchen table without being asked, accepted the coffee she offered because asking him not to stay would have required a firmness she wasn't yet certain was hers to use in someone else's house. He talked about land values and loan terms, and a mortgage that had been restructured after Mrs. Reid's medical costs, which had apparently been significant. He talked about a payment due in January that had been due the previous January as well. Only that time a leniency had been extended. He talked about the trust's considerable patience. He did not once look at the children's drawings pinned to the wall above the stove, or the small wooden horse Callum had left on the windowsill, or anything that might remind him he was sitting in someone's life. Reid came in at noon, and something changed in the room immediately. Not loudly. He didn't raise his voice or move aggressively. He just came through the door, and Croft stood up straighter, and the air got different. Croft, Reid said. Reid. The man smoothed his coat. I was just explaining the situation to your... I know the situation. January 15th. I said I know. Croft left shortly after, with the particular speed of a man who has made his point and would like credit for it. Reid stood at the window and watched the wagon until it was out of sight, then turned around and looked at Isobel for a moment like he'd forgotten she was there. How much do they want? She asked. He named a figure. It was large. Not enormous in the way of fortunes, but enormous in the way of impossible. The kind of money a working ranch could not produce in 6 weeks in winter. Is there family? She asked. No, a neighbor who might? No. His voice wasn't sharp, just final. The voice of a man who'd already been around every corner of this problem and found no door. I'll work it out. He went back outside. Isobel stood in the kitchen, looking at the number she'd written on the back of an envelope without thinking, trying to remember how numbers like that were solved and coming up empty. She did not sleep well that night. Lay in the narrow room listening to the house settle in the cold, thinking about the look on Rosie's face in the doorframe when Croft had been talking. That careful blankness again, the one that meant she understood more than anyone thought she did. Isobel had worn that face herself at 12 years old when her father's debts had come to collect. She knew what came after it. In the morning she asked Reid, carefully and not once looking at him while she did it, whether she could see the loan documents. He stopped eating, set down his fork. Why? Because I kept accounts for my aunt's shop in Winnipeg for 6 years and I might see something. A long silence. Outside, Callum was arguing with a fence post about something. They're in the study, Reid said, and picked up his fork again. The documents were a tangle of restructured payments and accrued interest and a clause buried on page 4 of the original agreement that had been added by hand in a different ink than the rest of the contract. Isobel read it 3 times. Then she read page 7. Then she went back to page 4. She didn't say anything to Reid that night. She needed to be certain before she said anything. Dorothy came Sunday. Isobel waited until Reid had taken the children out to feed the horses, then said, Does Dunmore Creek have a solicitor? Dorothy looked at her. Perkins, on the main street. Why? Does he know land law? His father practiced in Calgary. Why? Isobel showed her the clause on page 4. Dorothy read it twice. Then she looked up with an expression that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. That man made his own trap, she said. If I'm reading it correctly, I'll drive you into town Monday. Perkins was a young man who seemed faintly surprised to have a visitor in December, but he read the documents with the focused attention of someone who'd been waiting for something interesting to cross his desk. He confirmed what Isobel had found. The clause on page 4, added in that different ink, actually contradicted a term in the original agreement in a way that, under Alberta law, made the restructured terms unenforceable. The January payment was due, yes, but under the original terms, which were smaller and not due until spring. They were counting on him not reading closely, Perkins said. They were counting on him being too tired and too grieved to read at all, Isobel said. She brought the documents home, laid them on the kitchen table after supper when the children were in bed. Reid sat across from her while she explained it, her finger moving along the relevant lines, not looking at him because it felt important that this not be a performance, and looking at him would have made it one. When she finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough that she worried she'd misread something after all. Say it again, Reid said. She said it again. Another silence. Then, how did you find that? I spent 6 years reading contracts for a woman who didn't trust anyone who brought paper into her shop. She made me suspicious of ink that doesn't match. Reid sat back. He had a hand flat on the table and he looked at it for a moment. Perkins is certain. He said he'd put it in writing for nothing if you needed it for Croft. Something crossed Reid's face that she hadn't seen on it before. Not relief exactly. Relief was too simple, more like the particular feeling of a wall that you've been leaning on for a very long time turning out to be a door. Thank you, he said. It was the same thank you he said for meals. But it was different than those. She could tell. Croft came back in January, as expected, with a sharper expression and a man from Lethbridge she didn't recognize. Reid met them at the door with Perkins' letter and a copy of the original contract with the relevant sections marked. Isobel watched from the kitchen window, hands wrapped around a cup of tea, while the conversation on the porch ran through its stages. Croft's initial confidence, then the slow reading of the letter, then a consultation in low voices with the man from Lethbridge, then a tone shift she could read even through glass. They left after 20 minutes. Reid came back inside and stood in the kitchen without sitting down for a moment. The children were at school. The house was very quiet. He'll come back with something else, Reid said. Men like that always do. Probably, Isobel said. But not today. He almost smiled. She caught the edge of it before he turned to go back to work. The winter continued. Reid began gradually and without announcement to come inside earlier. Not always. Not dramatically. But sometimes he'd be in by 5, sitting at the table with the account books, and he'd look up when she came in and not look back down immediately. They talked about small things, the price of feed, Rosie's reading, whether Callum's cough needed a doctor or just time. Practical things, said in practical voices, but more of them than before. Rosie started sitting with Isobel in the evenings, showing her things, a book she liked, a drawing she'd made, once a small pressed flower from a collection she kept in a tin box under her bed that had belonged to her mother. Isobel held it carefully. It's a pasque flower, Rosie said. Mama said they come up before the snow is even gone. She said they were stuck. They are, Isobel said. I always liked that about them. Rosie looked at her. Do you miss where you came from? Isobel thought about the apartment in Winnipeg, the shop. The aunt who had been difficult and funny and deeply fond of her in a way she'd never said plainly but had shown in other ways every day. I miss a few things, she said, but I'm not sorry I left. Rosie seemed to be thinking this over. Papa's not sorry you came, she said finally. He's just bad at saying so. I know, Isobel said. February brought a cold so hard the pump froze for 3 days, and Reid spent an entire morning with hot water and a blanket coaxing it back. He came inside that afternoon with ice in his beard and sat at the table while Isobel put coffee in front of him without being asked. And he said, My father lost a ranch when I was 14. Debt. Same kind of thing. He wrapped both hands around the cup. Swore I'd never let it happen. Isobel sat down across from him. Margaret got sick in the fall, he continued. We'd had a bad year before that. By the time she started again differently. By the time it was just me and the children, the debt was larger than I'd admitted to anyone. I applied for the restructuring because a man from the trust said it was the sensible option. He counted on you trusting him. I counted on myself being smarter than I was. His jaw shifted. Turned out I was just tired. That's not the same thing as stupid, Isobel said. He looked at her across the table. The afternoon light came through the window at a low winter angle, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she noticed that he wasn't just weathered. He was also underneath it, not so many years older than she was. He'd just been carrying something heavy for a long time, and it showed the way heavy things always showed, in the set of the shoulders and the economy of expression. No, he said. I suppose it's not. Croft came back in March with a different argument. that the original agreement had a default clause triggered by missed payments in the interim year, the previous January, which had been marked as an extension, but could be reread, he said, as a technical default. Reid brought Perkins. Isobel came too at Reid's request, which surprised her enough that she asked him once if he was certain. You found it the first time, he said. They sat across the table from Croft and the Lethbridge man, and a third person this time, a woman who turned out to be a solicitor named Hargreaves, who had the careful expression of someone being paid to be certain of things she privately wasn't. Perkins walked through the original agreement. Isobel had prepared notes, 3 pages in her small, clear handwriting, documenting the sequence of payments and the language of the extension, and why it could not reasonably be read as a default under the statute. Hargreaves read the notes twice. Then she said something quietly to Croft that Isobel couldn't hear, but the effect was immediate. The trust will review its position, Croft said. Let us know what you decide, Reid said. Outside afterward, in the cold street, while Perkins shook both their hands and went back to his office, Reid stood beside Isobel for a moment looking at nothing in particular. Where did you learn to do that? He asked. Write notes? Prepare for a fight you weren't sure you could win. Isobel thought about her aunt, who had once faced down a wholesale supplier who'd shorted her order by a third and billed her for the full amount, and had done it with nothing but a handwritten ledger, and the specific patience of a woman who had never once in her life been let off a hook she'd earned. I learned it from someone who didn't have the option of losing, she said. They drove home in the wagon in companionable quiet, which felt like something that had been built slowly over months without either of them deciding to build it. April came. The frozen mud thawed into regular mud. Pasque flowers came up exactly as Rosie had said they would, before the snow was completely gone, pushing up through the last dirty gray patches with what looked like considerable nerve. Callum brought one inside for Isobel one morning and stood in the doorway, holding it out with the solemnity of someone presenting an important document. For you, he said. Isobel took it and put it in a glass of water on the windowsill. Thank you, Cal. He beamed. It still happened suddenly with him, the smiling, like a lamp switched on. He ran back outside. The trust sent a letter in April. Their position had been reviewed. The original terms of the loan stood. There was no default. The spring payment per the original agreement would be expected at the appointed time and was, it turned out, manageable. Reid read the letter at the table, then folded it and set it down. That's done then, he said. Yes, Isobel said. A pause. Outside, Rosie and Callum were doing something complicated in the mud that involved a stick and strong opinions. I owe you a conversation, Reid said, looking at the letter rather than at her. Isobel waited. When I wrote the advertisement, he said slowly, choosing words like he was choosing safe ground to step on. I wasn't. I told myself I needed help for the children. That was true. But Dorothy had been saying it for 2 years and I hadn't done anything about it. I did it when I did it because the debt was coming due and I thought, he stopped. I thought if things went wrong with the property, I didn't want to be doing it alone. You weren't planning to tell me that? No, why are you telling me now? He looked up from the letter. Because you stayed. And because you found a way out of something I'd given up on. And because when Croft came in March, you asked if I was certain I wanted you there. And I should have said then that I was. He held her gaze. I was certain. Isobel set down the dish towel she'd been holding. The arrangement in the letter was for a housekeeper. I know what the letter said. I'm not objecting, she said. I'm just making sure we're talking about the same thing. Something that had been sitting in the corner of Reid's eyes very carefully for a long time came out into the open. Isobel, he said. Yes, I'm not good at this. I know, I've noticed. She sat down across from him. I'm not asking you to be good at it. I'm asking if you want to try. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the children were laughing about whatever the stick had become. The kitchen smelled of the bread she'd put in an hour ago, and the coffee was still warm, and the light through the window was the particular light of an Alberta spring that always felt slightly miraculous after how long the dark lasted. Yes, Reid said. I want to try. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a sweep of dramatic feeling. It was the word of a man who had learned that the only things worth having were things you said plainly and then worked toward with your hands and your presence and your consistency. Isobel understood that. She'd been raised by a woman who showed love by staying up until the accounts were balanced. She'd learned the same language. All right, she said. Summer arrived slowly, the way it always did in that part of the country, tentatively and then all at once. The fields greened up. Reid hired a hand named Prescott for the busy months, a quiet young man from Medicine Hat, who was good with horses and asked no questions. The children finished school and were underfoot constantly, which turned out to be something Isobel enjoyed more than she'd expected. She'd never thought of herself as someone who was good with children, and she wasn't sure she was exactly good with them now, but she was honest with them, and it turned out that mattered more. Rosie showed her the rest of the tin of pressed flowers. Named each one, Isobel wrote them down in her account book in the margins, because it seemed like the kind of thing that should be written somewhere. Callum taught her the proper way to feed the horses, which he considered very important, and explained at considerable length. Dorothy came every Sunday and watched all of this with an expression she clearly felt no need to conceal. "You're not leaving at the end of the summer," she told Isobel one afternoon. "It wasn't a question." "No," Isobel said. "I don't think I am good." Dorothy refilled her own cup without being asked, the way she always did. The way that meant she'd made herself at home in this kitchen long before Isobel arrived and intended to go on doing so. "Reid needs someone who reads the ink. He's better at it now," Isobel said. "He caught something in the feed supplier's bill last month before I did." Dorothy smiled at her coffee. "Of course he did." Croft did not come back. The trust, it emerged through Dorothy's considerable network of information, had discovered that the clause Isobel had identified was not isolated. There were 3 other farmers in the district with similar additions to similar documents, and at least one of them had already spoken to a solicitor in Calgary. The trust had gone very quiet. The man from Lethbridge had reportedly left the company. Reid told her this on an evening in August, when they were sitting on the porch after the children were in bed. He'd started doing this sometimes, sitting on the porch in the good weather after supper, long enough to let the day settle. Isobel had started joining him. "Perkins thinks there may be grounds to report it," Reid said. "Formally, there may be. He's asking if I want to pursue it. What do you want to do?" Reid looked out at the darkened fields. A warm night quiet, the kind that felt like a gift after winter. "I want to make sure the other farmers know they have the same option we had," he said. "After that, I'm less interested in punishment than in getting on with things." Isobel nodded. That sounded right to her. Not forgiving in the way of pretending it hadn't happened, but finished with it in the way of choosing where your energy went. "I'll write it down," she said. "What Perkins needs. You can look it over and tell me if I've got the details right. You'll get the details right. You should check anyway." He turned and looked at her with the directness he'd been doing more often lately. The kind that wasn't calculating anything, just looking. "You're doing it again," he said. "What?" "Making sure I'm involved. Making sure it's mine." She met his eyes. "Isn't it?" "It's ours," he said simply. It was the first time he'd said that word in that way. She felt it land somewhere in her chest and stay there. "Ours," she agreed. They sat a while longer in the warm dark. The cattle made occasional sounds in the distance. Somewhere nearby, an owl was making up its mind about something. Later, she would think about the way that summer felt, not like an arrival exactly, because she'd arrived in October, and it had been 10 months of learning the language of a place and a family and a particular silence, but like the moment a thing stops being new and becomes simply real. The ranch was hard work. Reid was still a man of few words who expressed most of his feelings through action and would probably always be. The children were not hers by blood and never would be, but Rosie had started calling her by her name with the particular ease that meant it belonged to her now, and Callum pressed flowers into her hands whenever he found them and seemed to consider this a complete statement of his position. It was not a simple life. Debt didn't disappear because you found a clause that saved you. It shaped itself into something else you had to manage. The winters were long and the work was physical, and there were days when the isolation of the place pressed down like the cold pressed down, relentless and without interest in how you felt about it. But there was the bread smell in the mornings. There was Reid's hand on the small of her back the first time he reached for her, tentative and then certain. There was Rosie's voice reading aloud, getting stronger week by week. There was Callum's lamp-switching smile. There was Dorothy every Sunday like a fixed star. There was the particular piece of a kitchen in the evening, with the lamp lit and the accounts balanced, and nothing needing to be fought tonight. There was the pasque flower on the windowsill, replaced each spring, stubborn as promised. Isobel Vane had come to Dunmore Creek, with a carpet bag and a letter worn through at the fold lines, and the practiced expression of someone who had learned not to want things too openly in case they were taken away. She stayed as someone who had learned, more slowly and with more difficulty, that wanting things was not the danger. The danger was building them on someone else's terms. The danger was the ink that didn't match. She had read that ink. She had stayed. That was, it turned out, the only kind of love she'd ever wanted. The kind that asked you to read carefully and then rewarded you for doing so with something real. Something that couldn't be restructured or defaulted or handed over to a man from Lethbridge to manage on your behalf. Something that was, in the plainest and most sturdy sense of the word, hers.